It didn't smell like a battlefield at all. It smelled like a workshop. Picture this: a dim hangar on the outskirts of Hamburg, shadows thrown long across the concrete, and a circle of German engineers in oil-stained white coats, bending over a wreck that looked more like broken cabinetry than an enemy aircraft. Under the harsh floodlights lay a captured Mosquito bomber, almost intact after being forced down in a farmer's field. Its pale wooden skin seemed bizarrely domestic, as if someone had dragged a half-finished armoire into a military depot instead of a machine built for war. They had been warned that this was the swiftest bomber in British service, a phantom capable of leaving Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs gasping behind it at full power. But how could that be? To engineers of the Luftwaffe, wood was a relic, something that belonged in dusty museums beside biplanes, not in an age obsessed with jet engines and high-octane fuel. Dear friends, if this video has reached you, it's not by chance. Right now, click the subscribe button and the notification bell. Write a number from 1 to 5 in the comments. I will personally respond to the first 50 comments, and make sure to watch the video until the end. Dr. Karl-Heinz Henkel, senior materials analyst of the Luftfahrt Ministerium, adjusted his spectacles and tapped one of the panels with his knuckles. The sound that answered him was soft and echoing, nothing like the ring of metal, more akin to knocking on a coffin lid. "It's plywood," he murmured, disbelief creeping across his face. A few technicians snickered. "A wooden bomber," one of them muttered. "The English must have run out of aluminum." They had expected to find splinters, perhaps a curiosity. Certainly not a machine that had mocked German air defenses for nearly 2 years. Outside, rain whispered against the roof, while inside the air was heavy with the sting of phenolic resin, sharp, sweet, chemical, halfway between varnish and scorched sugar. It clung to their clothes, settled in their throats. Still, they worked on, dissecting the aircraft with the meticulousness of surgeons. No rivets, no welds. Every surface fused, not fastened. The joins were so smooth they shimmered under the lights like polished stone. Henkel wedged a chisel between 2 layers and pried. The blade snapped. He stared at the broken metal in his hand. "This is no carpenter's glue," he muttered. His assistant offered, "Some kind of resin, perhaps bakelite?" Henkel shook his head. "Bakelite shatters. This bends. This endures. It's almost alive." He set a fragment beneath a magnifying lens. The fibers weren't merely bonded. They flowed together like living grain. But what unsettled them most wasn't the material. It was the artistry. Every curve of the fuselage felt deliberate, shaped with a craftsman's intuition. The British, Henkel realized, had built this airplane the way a luthier builds a violin, layer after layer, tone after tone, elegance concealing strength. As the Germans measured, sketched, and photographed, the quiet mocking faded. The more they explored the Mosquito, the more they sensed a mind at work, a designer who had anticipated their doubt and answered it at every seam. By midnight, the floor lay strewn with sketches, shavings, and abandoned coffee cups. Henkel sat back, massaging his temples, surrounded by the puzzle pieces of an aircraft that defied conventional logic. The numbers refused to lie. This toy, this wooden apparition, had outraced their best metal bombers. Somehow, wood had triumphed over steel. Henkel gazed at the pale wing root glowing under the lamps and whispered, "How?" The irony gnawed at him. Germany, the shrine of precision engineering, had been outpaced by something assembled in furniture workshops. From outside came the muted rumble of night bombers passing overhead, the faint soundtrack of an empire wearing thin. And there, among the scents of glue and damp timber, the question shifted. It was no longer, does it work? But why does it work? What secret within that glue had made the Mosquito so untouchable? Flash back to 1938. While the world braced itself for another war drenched in metal and machinery, one man stood before the British Air Ministry with a proposal that seemed almost like a prank. Geoffrey de Havilland. Calm, elegant, quietly unyielding unrolled blueprints of a bomber that mocked every rule of modern aviation. No defensive guns, no armor, and most absurd of all, made almost entirely of wood. The officials listened with strained politeness, waiting for the punchline. It never arrived. So they dismissed him. Metal, they insisted, was the future. Wood belonged in attics. Yet de Havilland did not waver. He understood something that couldn't fit into committee minutes or procurement spreadsheets. Speed itself could be armor. Simplicity could be survival. Britain, even then, was stretched thin. Aluminum, the lifeblood of modern aircraft, was vanishing into Spitfires, Hurricanes, and soon the lumbering Lancasters. De Havilland looked at the shortage and saw not a crisis, but a gap in the logic of war. His company had spent years mastering the art of wooden aircraft nimble racers, elegant light planes. Across Britain, thousands of small workshops sat idle. Furniture makers, piano craftsmen, cabinet builders, men whose hands could coax miracles from timber, but who had no role in the metal-bound war. What if, he wondered, their skill could be turned towards something faster, lighter, quieter than anything yet imagined? He envisioned a bomber built like a violin, not a fortress. A two-man cockpit shaped to a bullet's outline. No turrets, no gunners, only speed. Layers of birch plywood paired with Ecuadorian balsa at the core, chosen not for glamour but for geometry. Birch for strength, balsa for weightlessness. The adhesive stronger than rivets, stronger than bolts, would fuse them into a laminated monocoque shell borrowed from the world of fine furniture. Every pound saved in armor would become miles per hour gained in flight. If it could outrun fighters, why fight at all? But when war erupted in 1939, his vision seemed to evaporate beneath the weight of doctrine. The Air Ministry demanded gunships' metal strongholds meant to give and take punishment. Heavy, armed, armored. War, however, has a habit of humbling certainty. By 1940, the fall of France still fresh, the Blitz tearing at British nights, the shortages grew so desperate that even impossible ideas returned to the table. De Havilland came again, blueprint in hand, insisting that his wooden bomber could rise from furniture factories without depriving a single Spitfire of aluminum. Grudgingly, they granted him permission to build one prototype. And so, in the autumn of 1940, beneath the gray skies of Hertfordshire, the first Mosquito began to take form. Piano makers from London shaped its wings with tender precision. Violin craftsmen molded its curved nose. A war machine born not from steel mills, but from artistry, from hands that once built music. The glue that held every seam together was no ordinary adhesive. It came from the laboratories of furniture makers, a phenol formaldehyde resin, a synthetic concoction that hardened into a substance almost like amber. Layered between sheets of wood and pressed under heat, it fused them into a single material. Neither wood nor plastic, yet both resilient and remarkably strong. Imagine that, a creation born from the marriage of craftsmanship and chemistry. On November 25, 1940, the prototype, painted a striking training yellow, rolled onto the runway at Hatfield. Geoffrey de Havilland Jr., the designer's own son, climbed into the cockpit. The engines rumbled to life, twin Merlins vibrating like caged beasts. Would it lift? Would it survive its first flight? The crowd held its breath. And then, it didn't struggle. It soared. Weightless, defiant, it climbed faster than any bomber anyone had ever seen. At altitude, its speed surpassed 390 miles per hour, faster than the Spitfire Mk1, faster than any fighter then in service. The Air Ministry observers, who had stood silently, could only whisper in disbelief. A wooden aircraft had outrun the finest machines of metal and myth. That night, de Havilland wandered alone through his workshop, past half-finished frames glowing under the lamps. He placed his hand on one of the laminated panels, feeling the warmth of the curing glue. Smooth, alive with promise. The world of war would never be the same. A bomber built from furniture wood had just proven that imagination could outrun fear. When the Mosquito entered combat, it carried no guns, no gunners, and no illusions. Its survival relied on mathematics alone. Pilots who first received the aircraft in 1941 could scarcely believe it. Men accustomed to lumbering Blenheims and Wellingtons were now asked to fly a machine slim, graceful, almost fragile in appearance. The crew, just two men, sitting shoulder to shoulder in a cockpit barely large enough for both. No rear gunner, no armor between them and the waiting flak. The flight manual was brutally simple. If intercepted, do not fight. Run. Trust the Merlin engines. Skepticism at the Air Ministry had long vanished. Obsession had taken its place. Official tests at Boscombe Down had clocked the Mosquito at nearly 400 miles per hour, faster than any operational fighter in the Luftwaffe's arsenal. But speed on a chart and survival in enemy skies were two very different things. The Mosquito would need to prove that swiftness could replace armor. Its baptism of fire came on September 20th, 1941. A formation of Mosquitoes from No. 105 Squadron took off from Swanton Morley for a daylight bombing raid over Oslo. Their mission was surgical: strike the Gestapo headquarters and return before enemy fighters could react. Flying just 50 feet above the sea, their wooden wings cut through spray and mist. Radar stations detected them too late. By the time the Luftwaffe scrambled fighters from Stavanger, the Mosquitoes were already heading home. Witnesses spoke of a ghostly roar, followed by silence, as if the planes had simply vanished. Every aircraft returned unharmed. The next trial was even bolder. In January 1943, a Mosquito reconnaissance flight penetrated Berlin in broad daylight. Sirens wailed across the city, not for a massive raid, but for two unarmed bombers outpacing every defender. Luftwaffe radar operators watched in helpless frustration as the blips accelerated beyond pursuit. When the Mosquitoes dropped their 500-pound bombs, Hermann Göring himself was in conference. Furious, he screamed that the attack was a personal insult and ordered interceptors to chase at all costs. None succeeded. By early 1943, Mosquito crews had begun to understand their machine's rhythm. At 25,000 feet, it danced through flak bursts like a leaf in a storm. The laminated wood absorbed vibrations that would have shattered metal. Direct hits often failed to ignite fires. Without aluminum, there were fewer sparks, less fuel vapor to ignite. Pilots spoke of flying a living creature, flexible, forgiving, responsive. One crew, returning from a low-level raid over Cologne, recounted tracer fire chasing them through the Rhine Valley. The shells seemed to float beside us, then fall away, as if the air itself were protecting us, they said. News of the Mosquito spread rapidly. British newspapers called it the Wooden Wonder. German pilots whispered, Der Teufel aus Holz, the devil of wood. Morale shifted overnight. Luftwaffe squadrons were told, if a Mosquito appears, do not pursue unless conditions are perfect. In level flight, it could not be caught. In dives, it exceeded the structural limits of German planes. Each sortie built legend. In February 1943, Mosquitoes from NAS 105 and 139 squadrons executed one of the most daring precision strikes of the war, a daylight raid on Berlin timed with a speech by Göring. Windows rattled across the Reichstag as explosions echoed. The propaganda censors could not hide the humiliation. Wooden bombers had struck the heart of the Third Reich and returned intact. The RAF began reorganizing operations around this singular blend of speed and stealth. The Mosquito became the aircraft of choice for photo reconnaissance, pathfinding, and surgical bombing. Every mission confirmed a stark truth. The lighter you flew, the faster you flew, the longer you lived. Pilots came to believe the plane was almost immortal, the aircraft that forgot how to die. But across the channel, in the cold laboratories of the Luftwaffe, disbelief had turned into obsession. How could a plywood aircraft humiliate their finest machines? To the Germans, it was no mere military failure. It was a scientific affront. Inside those smooth wooden panels lay a secret they were determined to uncover. In spring 1943, a British Mosquito on a reconnaissance flight over northern Germany was caught in a flak storm. The pilot glided for miles before crash landing in a marsh near Hamburg. When German troops reached it, they expected twisted metal and molten fragments. Instead, they found what resembled a broken boat. Smooth wooden panels, light enough for a man to lift, still faintly scented of resin and smoke. The Luftwaffe's technical branch recognized a gold mine. Every fragment was sent to a secret hangar near Rechlin, their primary testing ground. There, under harsh floodlights, the Mosquito lay on wooden trestles like a patient on an operating table. Engineers, accustomed to steel and rivets, welding torches and gauges, now circled with sanding blocks and glue. The first cuts were cautious, almost surgical. Each layer revealed more mysteries. A thin birch veneer, only a few millimeters thick, was astonishingly uniform. Beneath it, a balsa honeycomb air light, yet astonishingly stiff. Another layer of birch followed, fused seamlessly as though grown from a single tree. Dr. Karl-Heinz Henkel, an expert in metal fatigue, stood in awe. "They've turned carpentry into engineering," he muttered. His team tested density, tensile strength, and shear resistance. Every result defied expectation. The laminated composite bore nearly twice the load of aluminum at half the weight, resisting moisture, heat, and vibration. A hydraulic press could crack the wood, but never the adhesive. Unlike the German Kassen glue, which degraded in heat and humidity, this British resin endured everything. Chemical analysis revealed an unknown compound, a phenol formaldehyde synthetic resin catalyzed under pressure. When heated, it didn't soften. It hardened further, forming a thermoset polymer that bonded wood fibers at the molecular level. In effect, it was synthetic armor hidden inside wood. Henkel could only glare, frustration mingling with disbelief. Germany's chemical industry, once the crown jewel of the modern world, had produced marvels. Synthetic fuel, rubber, explosives, but nothing like this. Nothing even close to the adhesive that held the Mosquito together. The reason was painfully simple: resources. Phenolic resins demanded phenol and methanol, extracted from coal tar, and both were being swallowed whole by explosives production. Even if the Luftwaffe had possessed the secret formula, mass production was impossible. The discovery ignited a storm of admiration and despair. The Mosquito was not merely fast, it was a triumph of practical genius. Every component told a story of adaptation. Shortages had become the mother of invention. The fuselage was molded in two mirror image halves, shaped over concrete forms in furniture workshops. When joined, they created an airtight shell, requiring no internal bracing. The result? Smoother, lighter, and stronger than any riveted construction the Germans could produce. A young engineer, Vogel, leaned over a wing cross-section beneath a magnifying lens. "It looks alive," he whispered. And he was right. The glue lines traced intricate patterns, like veins in a leaf. The structure flexed under stress instead of fracturing, It absorbed shocks, dissipated energy, then returned to its shape. In a world obsessed with rigidity, the Mosquito had been built to bend. Henkel presented his findings to Luftwaffe command. Silence filled the room. He placed 2 samples on the table. One aluminum, one laminated birch bonded with British resin. The wooden piece bent, then snapped back. The aluminum stayed deformed. "Gentlemen," he said quietly, "we have been building the wrong kind of strength." But pride dies hard. Some officers scoffed that glue could ever win a war. Others demanded a German replica, the Mucha, or not, to prove the concept. Yet deep down, the engineers understood the truth. They could mimic the shape, the dimensions, even the engines. But they could not replicate the soul of the Mosquito, the glue that transformed fragile wood into a weapon. As they packed the samples for Berlin, the scent of the British resin lingered, sweet, sharp, unyielding. Henkel lingered, gloved fingers tracing a splintered wing. "They built this in a furniture factory," he whispered, "and we, with all our steel, cannot catch it." Orders came from the top. If the British could build a wooden bomber that outpaced every German fighter, Germany would respond. Faster, stronger, deadlier. The project received a mocking name. Mucha the Knot, meant to sting the British Mosquito. On paper, it was a statement of pride, a promise that German engineering could master any Allied innovation. In reality, it became a slow-motion tragedy of overconfidence. The first prototypes landed in a small Luftfahrtversuchsanstalt lab in Braunschweig. They began with the captured drawings and Henkel's painstakingly catalogued fragments. From the start, the numbers betrayed them. The British had used lightweight balsa from Ecuador, a material Germany could no longer import. German engineers substituted pine and beech, harder, heavier, more plentiful. A single Mosquito wing weighing 280 kilograms ballooned to 410 in the Mucha. The glue was compromised, too. Without phenolic resin, they used caisson mixed with formalin. It held in dry conditions, but softened under heat and moisture. A flaw every engineer recognized, but none dared report. Still, the Reich demanded results. Henkel's warnings were quietly rewritten before reaching Berlin. Production orders went to furniture factories in Dresden and Kassel, the very same kind of workshops the British had used successfully. But under German conditions, chaos reigned. Raw material shortages, relentless air raids, untrained labor. Where the Mosquito was born from creativity, the Mucha was born of desperation. By late 1943, the first prototype stood complete, a pale, sleek imitation of the British original. Under floodlights, it looked convincing enough. Smooth fuselage, identical dimensions. Yet the illusion ended the moment it took flight. Hauptmann Ernst Kessler, the test pilot, felt it immediately. Sluggish controls, unexpected vibrations at high speed. At 350 miles per hour, the wings began to resonate. The laminated layers groaned. Thin cracks raced along the leading edges. He throttled back and landed hard, the undercarriage collapsing under strain. Investigators discovered the culprit. Moisture had seeped into the glue, weakening the joints. The adhesive had not failed completely, but it had softened enough to distort the aerodynamic shape. In aviation, just enough is fatal. The second prototype fared no better. Modifications added bracing and altered adhesives, yet it flew heavier and slower. On paper, it could reach 360 miles per hour, faster than a Heinkel He 111, but still 50 miles per hour shy of the Mosquito. The third prototype disintegrated entirely during a low-altitude dive test. Pilots were blamed, yet the truth was clear. The wood delaminated mid-flight, tearing the wing from the fuselage. By 1944, the Mucha project was dead. What remained were thick, meticulously detailed reports, filled with tables and graphs, but also a rare emotion in German technical writing: despair. One memorandum admitted plainly the design could not match British construction due to fundamental material limitations. In the margin of a test report, a note read, "We are fighting physics with paperwork." Inside the Reich Ministry of Aviation, no one wanted to deliver the news to Hermann Göring. His fury over the Mosquito was already legend. He had promised Hitler the skies, yet wooden bombers still flew above Berlin, taunting with every daylight raid. When he learned the Mucha had been cancelled, he smashed a glass ashtray against the wall, shouting, "We are defeated by carpenters." For the engineers, humiliation cut deeper than any reprimand. Germany's identity rested on precision metallurgy, control, and rigid rules principles the British had upended. The Mosquito was audacious. It broke every rule the Germans held sacred: never trust organic materials, never rely on manual craftsmanship, never tolerate variability. And yet it worked. Its wooden shell flexed where metal would crack, absorbed vibrations where rivets would fail. Henkel, watching the fiasco unfold, wrote in his journal that autumn, "We are trapped by our own logic. We have machines without imagination, and they have imagination without machines." He never sent it to his superiors. It would have sounded like treason. Yet among peers, the sentiment spread quietly. The British had won not by superior industry, but by the courage to defy their textbooks. As winter settled over the ruins of Germany, the Mosquitoes continued to haunt the skies. Sleek, silent, and untouchable. Their polished wooden skins reflected the moonlight like specters gliding across the night. Below them, men who had tried to replicate their brilliance crouched in workshops, surrounded by warped wings, cracked fuselages, and the acrid stench of failed adhesives. The Mosquito had delivered the ultimate lesson that no engineer wants to learn. Genius is simple to admire, impossible to duplicate. By 1944, the Mosquito was no longer merely a plane. It had become a presence. It moved through Europe's night skies like a whisper, a rumor that no one could anticipate or halt. Luftwaffe radar operators dreaded the fleeting blip that appeared and vanished before they could lock on. Interceptor pilots christened it Der Schattenjäger, the Shadow Hunter. Even ground troops, hearing its low, eerie whine at dawn, craned their necks skyward in fear. If a Mosquito could reach you, no one was safe. The numbers only reinforced the legend. Heavy bombers like the Lancaster suffered average losses of 5 to 7% per mission. For the Mosquito, it was less than 1. One aircraft lost for every 200 sorties. A Mosquito crew, unlike their comrades in slower, armored bombers, could survive dozens of missions. Pilots began to joke grimly that flying a Mosquito was safer than crossing Piccadilly after dark. Yet behind the humor lay something extraordinary. An unarmed plane had become the Royal Air Force's most survivable machine. Inside Germany, disbelief had curdled into humiliation. Each intelligence report that reached Hermann Göring's desk was another wound to his pride. He had promised Hitler that the Luftwaffe would maintain absolute air superiority. Now British bombers made daily visits, and the most infuriating of all, the Mosquito seemed to time its strikes for maximum insult. In January 1943, it had dropped bombs on Berlin just as Göring began a radio address. In January 1944, it repeated the feat during another high-profile meeting. Both times, it returned unscathed. Göring reportedly shouted, "I turn green with envy when I see those wooden aircraft flying over Berlin. The British can afford to lose pilots, but they don't, because they fly so fast that our fighters cannot catch them." The truth stung even more. While the Mosquito remained young and agile, Germany's best pilots were dying faster than they could be replaced, and the new generation lacked the skill to fight an enemy that refused to play by the rules. Conventional bombers could be intercepted, herded into kill zones. The Mosquito ignored all scripts. It struck in singles or pairs, skimmed treetops, and vanished into clouds. By the time radar detected it, it was already gone. At Rechlin and Peenemünde, engineers scrambled to develop faster interceptors' new variants of the Focke-Wulf 190, the high-altitude Me-410, even the jet-powered Me-262. On paper, jets could outrun the Mosquito. In practice, they could never be in the right place at the right time. Jet engines of that era demanded long runways, perfect fuel, and careful handling. The Mosquito needed only a patch of grass and 2 Merlin engines. For German civilians, the Mosquito became a psychological weapon more potent than any bomb. Its raids were precise railway stations, Gestapo offices, communication hubs, but the symbolic impact far exceeded the physical damage. In Berlin, whispers circulated that the British had built a plane invisible to radar. In occupied Copenhagen and Oslo, the resistance hailed its appearances as proof that the Allies could strike anywhere at any time. The Mosquito's roar became a sound of inevitability. The RAF exploited this ruthlessly. Heavy bombers would pound German cities at night. Mosquitoes flew ahead to drop incendiaries and flares, marking targets with pinpoint accuracy. When the bombers returned home, Mosquitoes struck rescue crews and command posts. Tireless, omnipresent, untouchable. Even a single Mosquito could force the Luftwaffe to scramble entire squadrons, burning fuel and exhausting pilots for nothing. The German High Command responded with desperation, disguised as strategy. New radar networks were built to track fast targets. Propaganda officers claimed the Mosquito was overrated, that its speed came at the cost of payload. But the numbers were indisputable. In 1944 alone, Mosquito bombers dropped over 19,000 tons of explosives, losing fewer than 200 aircraft. So precise was this efficiency that one British officer quipped, "It's not a bomber, it's a surgical instrument." By autumn, Göring's rage had slipped into superstition. He ordered aides never to speak the aircraft's name during briefings, as if silence could erase it. Fighter command logs tell the story of exhaustion, pilots claiming to chase phantoms that vanished into clouds, radar stations reporting blips moving faster than their instruments could measure, ground crews swearing they saw Mosquitoes at altitudes no piston engine could reach. The myth had outgrown the machine. Dr. Henkel, who had once dissected a captured Mosquito, watched it all unfold from his laboratory. He no longer corrected colleagues who called it a ghost. In private notes, he wrote, "It is not the wood that terrifies us. It is the idea that something so light can carry such power." By the final winter of the war, the Mosquito's very name could silence a room in German command centers. Reports of sightings were met with sighs rather than alarms. By the time the warning arrived, the damage was already done. The Luftwaffe still flew, but morale was hollowed out. To them, the Mosquito was not just an aircraft. It was inevitability, precision, and humiliation shaped into wings. When the war ended in 1945, the Mosquito had already become legend. It had flown more than 80,000 combat sorties, photography, bombing, pathfinding, night fighting, with losses so minimal that even statisticians questioned the figures. In the hangars of post-war Europe, the Mosquito seemed almost unreal. Its sleek wooden fuselage looked like an artifact from another world, too elegant to have emerged from the chaos that had birthed it. Germany lay in ruins. Cities smoldered under the scars left by the heavy bombers the Mosquito had guided with uncanny precision. Yet in the minds of the engineers who had survived the war, it was not the Lancaster or the B-17 they recalled with awe. It was the wooden ghost, the aircraft that had humiliated their science. At the war's end, Allied inspection teams invited captured German engineers to tour de Havilland's plant at Hatfield. Among them was Dr. Karl-Heinz Henkel, the very man who had once dissected a downed mosquito, marveling at its miraculous glue. Now, in the assembly hall, he watched craftsmen in overalls polish the curved fuselage halves before bonding them together. The smell of resin filled the air again. Sharp, chemical, unforgettable. He turned to his British escort, a young engineer barely out of university, and asked, "How many men designed this process?" The Britons smiled. "Not many," one said, "but thousands built it." Those words stayed with Henkel for years. In his post-war report, he wrote that the mosquito's true secret was not chemistry or aerodynamics, but culture. A willingness to let craftsmen and scientists share the same space. Where German factories had been ruled by rigid hierarchies and fear of failure, the British had embraced improvisation. A violin maker could teach an engineer about resonance. A chemist could learn from a furniture worker. Out of that collision of worlds came something no pure theory could have predicted. The lessons spread swiftly. In the late 1940s, engineers on both sides of the Atlantic began experimenting with laminated materials, fiberglass, resin composites, and later carbon fiber. All direct descendants of the mosquito's wooden skin. What had been born of scarcity became the foundation of abundance. The newly formed American aerospace industry studied de Havilland's methods carefully. Boeing engineers would call the Mosquito the ancestor of every composite airframe they built decades later. In Britain, the legend grew quietly. The Royal Air Force kept Mosquitoes in service well into the 1950s, long after jets dominated the skies. Pilots adored its agility, its silence, its soul. One veteran said simply, "It felt like the airplane wanted to live as much as you did." Museums displayed the Mosquito as a masterpiece of wartime design, but for those who had built it, the memory was humbler. The smell of sawdust, the rhythm of glue brushes, the hammering of piano craftsmen assembling spars while London shook under the Blitz. For de Havilland himself, the Mosquito's success was vindication. His seemingly impossible idea had not only worked, it had redefined engineering itself. "We were never trying to outmuscle the enemy," he once told a journalist. "We were trying to outthink him." His words would echo through generations of designers who followed. For the Germans who had attempted to imitate the Mosquito, the aircraft became a mirror reflecting their own limits. The Mucha prototypes were melted down after the war. None survived. But in the archives of West Germany's rebuilt aviation industry, Henkel's notes endured. The final line of his last wartime journal read simply, "They proved that imagination, when disciplined by necessity, is stronger than steel." Time transformed the Mosquito from weapon to lesson. It taught that progress sometimes comes not from abundance, but from desperation. Not from metal and muscle, but from daring to see beauty in the ordinary. Out of plywood and glue rose a machine that terrified an empire and redefined what was possible. Historians still debate whether the Mosquito was the greatest aircraft of World War II. The numbers speak for themselves. Faster than any fighter of its era, lighter than any bomber, and deadlier to the enemy's pride than to its troops. Walk past one in a museum today, and its varnished oak surface still gleams. You can almost smell the resin, the ghost of the glue that once defied an empire. The men who built it are gone, their names scattered across archives and airfields. Yet their idea remains alive every time a modern airliner lifts with composite wings, or a spacecraft launches wrapped in resin and fiber. They proved that technology is born not from comfort, but from courage. The courage to build what everyone else calls impossible. So the next time you see a Mosquito's photograph, slender, smooth, silent, remember what it represented. Not only British ingenuity, not only wartime necessity, but the moment when imagination outran fear. If you believe true strength lies in daring to dream beyond logic, comment number 1 below. And if you think the world still underestimates human creativity, leave a like and subscribe for more untold What'll We Do stories that remind us why even wood and glue can change history.